Elizabeth, it's so great to catch up with you again today. A couple of years ago, my colleagues and I published a paper on voice and amplification in AMJ. And I have to say, as we were writing and revising that paper, we so often imagined that we were writing to you because you have done such great work in the voice literature. We wanted to write something that we hoped that you would be proud of. So it's great to be able to chat with you today.
Oh, thank you. That's really flattering. And I love that paper. I think you just hit on something so important and so interesting and really just admire that paper in particular and your work more broadly.
Well, I am really happy to hear that because we did spend a lot of time talking about that. As you think back on your own research, Elizabeth, are there one to two, three simple, practical, underappreciated lessons you've learned that you'd most like to pass along to others?
Sure. So there are three lessons that I think stand out most distinctly from my research over many years, my whole my whole career. Uh, in various ways, my work has focused on issues around proactivity, ways in which people step up, take initiative, take action rather than being just a passive recipient. And so, I think the first lesson that really stands out for me is just the importance of being proactive. And while that might sound obvious, I think it is so easy for all of us. I certainly see this in myself of kind of waiting for things to come to you, not always recognizing that you may need to seek out information, ask how you're doing, seek out advice, volunteer for something, raise your hand, step up to the plate, really actively work on managing and building your network. And actively managing your career more broadly rather than just kind of waiting and seeing what comes your way. So that to me is lesson one.
Yeah, I think it's something that keeps coming up a lot more, just in even the last like 5 years for me. And maybe part of it stems from uh, the fact that I'm teaching leadership now. So in leadership, we talk about the proactive personality. And to be a leader, I was interviewing Stephen M.R. Covey, who is the son of Stephen Covey, just a couple weeks ago. And Stephen said, leaders go first. And that's being proactive. And maybe another reason why I've been thinking about this is when I was at Notre Dame, was there with Mike Krant, researcher who had developed the proactive personality scale. And so this is again something I've been thinking about a lot. Do you have projects on on being proactive, and what is it about that got you thinking, or what is it about your research that has got you thinking about the importance of proactivity?
Oh my goodness, I get into that in so many ways. The proactive personality idea and Mike Krantz' work in particular that's been so influential, really highlights that there are differences. Some of us are just more naturally proactive than others. So it's kind of part of our personality. But I also think an analogy can be made with leadership too, right? That some of us are maybe just more naturally equipped to be leaders, but leadership is also a choice, and being proactive is also a choice. And so I think to me, that's a more empowering idea than just, oh, I'm not a really proactive person and
Yeah.
therefore I'm going to be more passive. It's no, I can make a choice and I can maybe won't come as naturally to me as someone else, but it's something you can do, in any context. This is something that really goes back to my earliest work as a doctoral student, my dissertation. I became interested in feedback seeking and this idea that, and this was really kind of paradigm shifting at the time, this idea that feedback isn't just this resource that managers give to employees, but that all of us at work, it's something valuable to us, and that can be better performers and better able to meet our own personal goals if we're actively seeking out feedback. And so that was kind of my initial work, and then I broadened that to really be interested in a situation of change. The specific context I looked at is when you're coming in as a new person to a new organization and you don't know anything about how things work, and you're trying to kind of get up to speed. And a lot of the research that had been done to date talked about how new people have to be kind of shaped. The organization has to figure out how to teach them where and my work, my dissertation work was looking at how new employees, newcomers themselves need to be actively seeking out different types of information. And what my work showed was that those people who were more proactive in that process were actually adjusted more quickly and more easily and were more effective early on. And so I think that's been sort of a theme throughout my work as I've looked at different types of, whether it's advice seeking or information seeking or feedback seeking or network building, all things that, all the research kind of demonstrating that people that do more of that are more likely to be effective.
Very interesting to hear that this is kind of under the umbrella of so much of the work you've done, that being proactive. And I love this idea of leadership is a choice and being proactive is a choice. And there are just so many benefits from being proactive. Okay, great lesson. Any other lesson? I guess you said you had three. So how
I
about
have
the next
three, and
lesson?
yes, and lessons 2 and 3 are closely related, but I'll talk about them separately. So the second one is the ease of remaining silent. In other words, kind of this lesson that it is just so easy for us to not say something that really should or needs to be said. I think there are just so many barriers to speaking up, and my work on was kind of taking the flip side of proactive. It's how we often are not proactive, but we often don't speak up about problems, concerns, issues, misconduct. There are so many barriers to this: psychological barriers, social barriers, structural, cultural. And I think in some ways that's an important lesson of realizing that we are, in a sense, wired often to not have difficult conversations, not to say something that might create discomfort or disharmony or that might jeopardize our our careers in some way. And in some senses, kind of our default, particularly in a hierarchical relationship, is to keep our mouth shut. So that's kind of a lesson that has come through of just how powerful all those forces are to causing us to sit by and not say things. Um, and then that relates to lesson 3, which is the dangers of remaining silent, and kind of those go hand in hand. So this is something that is kind of is a very real phenomena, this tendency towards not voicing, but that being really, really dangerous, particularly if you think about the things, injustice, mistreatment, misconduct that people are particularly likely to not speak up about, and the implications for organizations, but also for individuals who can be victims of abuse and injustice.
I think this is another topic that's been coming up a lot, probably because I'm teaching ethics. And so we talk about the importance of standing up for what you believe in and voicing. And I've been interviewing one of my best friends all through childhood. He was my scoutmaster and mentor, and he ended up working at the lab in Los Alamos as a nuclear engineer. And he was telling me the other day that well, and let me back up. I always admire him because he's one of these people that always just stands up for what he believes is right, regardless of the consequences. And what he was saying is that he misses a lot of the social cues. He doesn't realize that you're not supposed to stand up, that there's all this social pressure. And so,
Mhm.
for example, he was working for this large oil company, and one of the trucks at the company didn't have brakes. Um, but you just had to regulate your speed through downshifting, but they wouldn't repair the brakes. And so when the safety inspector came out and said, are there any problems? My friend raises his hand and says, our truck doesn't have brakes. And all of his colleagues are like, what are you doing? Don't you know, like, aren't you in on this thing? We're not supposed to say anything. But he was so, in his words, he's so naive to the social cues
Mhm.
around him that he would just always voice when there was a problem.
Mhm.
And so I think this is interesting for many of us who are aware of these social dynamics. There's
Yeah.
so much pressure to not voice and not speak up. And one thing I remember, even as a child, my parents would teach me, if something is wrong, somebody does something bad, then, and if you get caught, you confess and whatever. And I remember in like middle school, or maybe even as early as elementary, there was this idea of a snitch and how the snitch is the worst thing. And it just was like so hard to reconcile in my mind, because
Mhm.
like, wait, I thought, telling the truth is a good thing. And so we get all this social pressure to
Exactly, and these mixed messages, I think this gets indoctrinated into us, throughout, I mean, from an early age of whether it's don't be a snitch to, respect authority, don't talk back, don't challenge your teacher, your, religious leader, your parents. And so I think we do get socialized to withhold. And of course, that's as social creatures, we have to be able to regulate what we shouldn't say anything that just comes to our
right.
mind. So we have to, that is functional in some senses. I think, though, it all can very easily change to dysfunctional and dangerous when we are not speaking up about things like the brakes that aren't working. And
Right.
that's such a, I mean, such a kind of terrifying, but also I think really telling story. In the first paper that I wrote on this phenomena of organizational silence, where we talk very much about those social cues and that social dynamics, we started that. Francis Millikan and I wrote that paper, and we started with the tale of the emperor who had no clothes, and it's this little boy who doesn't know better than to speak up, who calls out the obvious. And I think that's something, while it's a kind of a fable, it's all too real for many of us, that everyone knows the brakes aren't working, and yet because other people aren't saying anything, we keep our mouths shut as well.
Yeah, so what a great analogy. Yeah, the emperor has no clothes. That's a perfect example of this issue of so many of us get caught up on these social norms that we don't state the obvious. Any advice for people on how to overcome this? What does your research show on how can people take initiative and be more proactive in voicing when they're feeling the pressure not to?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I don't think we have complete answers to that. But what I would say is, what is encouraging is some of the work that has been looking at a more nuanced level of understanding what are the situational factors that are going to make it more or less likely that you will be heard, that you will not be punished. And that's about thinking about, the timing and who you're speaking to and how you're speaking up, and really realizing that, maybe something that needs to be said, maybe it's not the best thing to raise that in a meeting with lots of people. Maybe you should start with a one-on-one conversation. But then there's also recognizing that voice is going to be a process, and simply speaking up once, you may need to engage in it multiple times. And I think your work on amplification kind of speaks to that process of, it sometimes takes iterations and other, more than one person. It's a collective process of having your voice heard. So I think another piece of advice is really think about what allies you might have, other people that might be willing to, support you or speak up with you, and not feeling like, particularly in a high stakes situation, of feeling like you're just out there on your own.
Great way to think about it in terms of the context. We might feel like, oh, I have to voice right now in this moment because somebody said something or did something that is not okay. But being thoughtful about, well, how will this be received, and is there a better time and place? And then, great, which allies might I want to seek out and get help from? Well, I love these lessons. I think they are things that all of us can probably improve on. And before we hit record, you mentioned a quote, the distinction between, if you want to finish that quote, I love that quote.
Oh, yes. So wait, before you started recording?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we were talking about how some of these lessons, and thinking about, they're not something that are profoundly new, that nobody has thought about before. And I know, and you mentioned that, in our field, we often get perhaps some criticism, or at least we have some self-consciousness around the fact that a lot of our ideas seem obvious. You should be proactive. Okay, that's obvious. You should speak up when you see problems. That's obvious. But it was a quote that I heard, and I don't know who to attribute this to, this distinction between common sense and common practice. And so a lot of, I think, the things that our work in organizational behavior highlights, somebody can say, well, that's common sense. but it's not common practice. And so that raised the question, if this is something that is so obvious, why is it not something that we're doing? And so it suggests that there's knowing and doing are not necessarily the same thing.
Well, I love that quote. I love that idea. And your lessons are just perfect for this podcast in terms of simple, practical, underappreciated. And I had never heard that quote before, between common sense and common practice. And so that's something that I will take away from this interview as well. So I just appreciate you, Elizabeth, sharing your time with me. Thank you so much for sharing these lessons. And I look forward to sharing these lessons with my students and children and others.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay.